development bank or institution would have its country platforms, country programs and frameworks. So predictability is there. The question is it scalable and is it accessible? And scalability requires a lot of innovation, and it requires a lot of blending of different modes of financing from various sources. Otherwise, you don't achieve scale. There's not enough pot lying around, even with institutions who you think are extremely well funded. So the way, and I represent the Islamic Development Bank within the MDB community, the way we look at it, scalability, is to tap into innovative markets or niche sources of generating these sources of income. So one of the ways that we try to do that is to tap into green bonds, which we, in our regional parlance, call it green sukuk. And we've seen tremendous amount of appetite from investors to come up with those types of items. So innovation, at least with green sukuk, where you have targeted projects which you report on them to the market, has been there. And the third point, in terms of accessibility, it's a lot about coordination and lowering the transaction cost. I can talk a little bit more, but in the interest of time, I'll keep the conversation going through.
Yes. I'll come back to you on that, because you mentioned a lot of other stuff. But so expect a few more questions on that. Yes, over to you, Conrad, please.
Thank you very much. And I think it is also one point that we need to look for when we see regional MDBs, like our bank, the Regional Development Bank, we also don't have the scalability or also our capital to leverage all the opportunities that we have in the horizon, let's say in Central Asia, that we're really focusing on more. We have 3 countries that are part of our members: Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, and hopefully in the nearest future we also have Uzbekistan, all landlocked countries, especially Uzbekistan double-locked. So whenever we're looking for additional sources of capital, that's also we can look for sukuks, we can look for green bonds, we can social bonds, wherever is the ESG label. Those are the, let's say, standards that we have in the market, but we also need to tackle when is like the appropriate time to do that more. And even on transitional finance is something that we really care of in our bank, because we see that in this region in particular, and just hitting that as an example, we see that how is necessary to transition the existing base of the energy sector and other hard-to-abate sectors in Eurasia, specifically in Central Asia, that really demands and really needs international support. So international flows to be channeled in partnership with regional MDB. So we have ISDB, we have the World Bank, ADB, we have EBRD. They also have presence in the region, but the better coordination is exactly the key point that I see needs to be addressed between those local players that we have in the region. So that's how we can also scale up more, because in our banks we have more projects, we have more demand than we can supply with our current capital we can lend for those projects. And in our case, we're like an IFC of Eurasia. We're just working with the private sector, so it's even an additional, let's say, challenge to really find the capabilities for lending to those sectors. I also heard about the MSMEs and other important ventures that we need to supply with. We do this directly, not actually directly, we do this indirectly with local banks. There's also the importance of having the additional capital to lend for those and the final impact for SMEs as well in the region.
No, thank you. And I think unlike what I'm hearing right now, right? There's innovation in terms of instruments, and there's coordination and collaboration as 2 key elements. And Ms. Ajala, do you want to add more to that?
Yeah, I come from the background of a National Investment Promotion Agency. So we see on one side the MDBs and DFIs, they are committing numbers and they are wanting to help countries, I would say, achieve those commitment of clean transition. Now as individual government, I can talk about many other IPS who are working in similar space, what we are all doing. So what we do is, now there is a available limited pot from MDBs. Now how do we scale up? One of the questions you asked is that there is an available pot. How do we make it consistent and accessible and also scalable? So if we have to make it consistent, there's a limited pot. So when we are working locally in the country, what we are looking at is, we are looking at creating the supply side. So supply side, when I mean, we are creating the enabling policies. Say for example, if I have to speak about India, we are talking about committing to our net zero by 2070. We have our own 2030 NDC commitment, which talks about 45% reduction in emission. So there is a clear roadmap by the government, and there is a commitment by the government that this transition is happening. So there's a need for, say, sustainable infrastructure or clean tech companies. So the whole ecosystem gets activated and there is a signal in the market. That's one. Second, when we are talking about funds which are available at the MDBs, if we are going to look at them and funding those opportunities, I think it is a misplaced priority, I would say. The funds which we use mostly is to create that ecosystem, build the technical capacity and capability for the policymakers to do those enabling policies. Similarly to the ecosystem, like how we were talking about MSMEs, SMEs, Scope 3, organizations, how do we build capacity for them? How do we use them to create that demand side? Now supply side is there, now how do we create a demand side so that the market is ready with investable opportunities and private investments come into this space or domestic investments come into this space. So MDB money, we only keep them as an accelerator or just give that push, initial push, so that domestic and private investments come into the space. And that is what we think climate investment should be way forward.
So for climate finance to be consistent, there has to be a commitment, enabling environments in place to actually scale up, access finance to begin with. Now, before I go back to a round of questions, because Aniket is here, do you have any reactions from what they have been saying on the specific items?
I would just like to come in on the question of green bonds. Can you hear me? Yeah. Because I think that's a really important source of innovative finance. But there's relatively little experience with them in the LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS. I think only 3 SIDS so far have brought out green bonds, and possibly no LDCs have. So it's definitely an area which we could expand on, but you'll need to bring the private sector companies that specialize in this operation in. We will need to do some training and build some capacity at multiple levels to do that.
Well, thank you. So for a country like Nepal, Bangladesh, most of South Asia, they are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And we do have a private sector representative here in looking at that. What do you think are the challenges in terms of addressing adaptation, or on the side of more vulnerable countries? How do private sector, actually, I can ask anyone from the panel, how can private sector actually come in and accelerate climate finance on the adaptation side, coming from a more vulnerable country's perspective? Because we do have, a representative here for the LLDs, LDCs, SIDS. So in that context, maybe Aniket, you want to just start it off, just from your perspective. How do you see climate finance being accessed from that angle?
Well, I think much of the debate at the COPs tends to focus around the established mechanisms under the UNFCCC. That is to say, the GCF, the GEF, the Adaptation Fund, the LDCs Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund. So I'm very pleased to see that this panel includes representation from the Multilateral Development Banks and Investment Promotion Agency, because that, I think, potentially the sources of private finance that can be mobilized are much greater with broadening the range of actors around the table. One point which I do feel, and I sort of alluded to it in my remarks, is there are literally trillions of dollars that are looking for investment grade. How can we turn the private investment? How can we create a market for investment grade market in LDCs and SIDS? It's a big challenge, and it requires innovative approaches where you can package projects together, provide some kind of an umbrella, and chop up the pieces into something which is de-risked and then becomes an attractive proposition for investment grade. That might be one way of really bringing in the amounts that we need.
So maybe would you like to add some? Maybe I could direct this question to Conrad, just coming off from what Aniket was saying, is what do you think are the reforms that are actually needed to make climate compatible investments, or how do we accelerate or scale up those kinds of investments from your point of view?
And just to take away from the adaptation question, right? I think that's one of the many sources that we have, specialized funds like the Climate Fund, GCF, and others. I think the Adaptation Fund specifically, right? The fit for purpose. But and depending also how, let's say, from an MDB perspective, in our case, we don't have like much experience on adaptation because we are much more focused on infrastructure in hard to abate sectors. So we're essentially driven by mitigation. So in our backlog, in our track record, in our bank. Nevertheless, it does not stop us to try to establish, again, partnerships with other MDBs, with other funds, UN-related and non-related sources, including the private sector. But the private sector is, of course, the key point, how to be bankable, those projects, how to be attractive on the financial side. So then we need those grants, you need those other financial instruments that can be willing to be more affordable for the returns of those investments if you have the private sector to be weighting in those projects. On the question that is more on the reforms, then I really think what we are doing also from an MDB perspective, and I think my colleague can also complement on this, is basically on the G20 conversations that we're having here. In our case, again, in Central Asia, we are composed by 6 member countries. We have a 7 billion charter capital, 2 billion on equity. We're like a small to mid-sized bank. So we really are driven, and we can really be fruitful with partnerships, with strong partnerships from legacy MDBs, from global MDBs, and how we can channel more investments, let's say, to LDCs, to Central Asia, to other landlocked countries. That requires more the expansion of the shareholders, the existing, let's say, pay-in capital, and that's not necessarily easy to do whenever you have like emerging to frontier market countries that are your essence of your shareholders. So you really need also to go for non-regional shareholders to try to diversify your base of your capital, so that can be other additional potential investors. In Latin America, there are many examples. Let's say, I think it was the Central Bank, the Central CABE, the Central American Bank of Development. They have attracted Taiwan to be as a strategic investor, so non-regional, and they were successful. So they also improved their credit rating and probably their own ESG credentials, not saying about the safeguards, but specifically also in the ESG ratings can also be important for those MDBs to channel more investments. And in the end of the chain, that's also how you can get more of those projects. In our case, we have many projects in the field, but we don't have the capability on the financial component. So we need more capital to be able to lend more. So we have more demand than supply, and to do that in the end, we really need those partnerships to do it. So the G20 conversations is better harmonization that we're being discussed. This is something that is important for especially regional mid-sized MDBs like ours. And I will even say that we also have some other maybe hybrid mechanisms, even from the IMF. So there are SDRs that can be maybe considered. The AFDB also considered this option, I think was not so recent. But this is also something that can be more, funds that can be provided to other MDBs in the region. And those are focused in those smaller states or smaller economies like our bank.
Okay. So since we are on the topic of more, addressing vulnerable countries, their access to climate finance, Syed, and you've sort of almost mentioned it earlier about country platforms, and that is in part of the substantive framework as well of the NCQG on, access to finance through country platforms. What do you think is the role of country platforms in actually delivering climate finance, making it more accessible to more vulnerable countries?
Yeah, thank you, Ismaila. And first, I just want to, I'll come on the country platform.
Okay.
I just wanted to touch on
Address as well.
Aniket was right, capacity development, and I think to some extent even Conrad was mentioning. Some of these instruments, innovations which are available and are working, I was just going to give you an example on the green sukuk market. Just ISDB alone is able to raise $5.5 billion from the green sukuk market. This is not even the green bond market. So the market is there. Now, the problem is what you just mentioned, is that do we have those sustainable finance frameworks which LDCs and countries are able to come up with those frameworks, are able to apply, find the right partner who can take them to the market. That's the issue. It's not about the projects, it's not about the information on those projects. So I fully agree, and I think it goes to the capacity development portions, which then helps create that ecosystem, which I think Sujata was mentioning. And I completely agree that MDBs or institutions sometimes do not have to directly engage all the time. It's more about creating those networks and environment where we can engage with others. Now, to come to country platform, and I think that this goes back to the first conversation we were having today, was, look, one of the issues, especially with the Global South, and we represent a significant number of our membership is from the Global South. One of the biggest issues we feel is that the countries have to deal with very high transaction costs. You have multiple MDBs, and I'm not naming names per se, multiple MDBs coming to the same country, going almost through the same motions, going through similar review mechanisms. I mean, you're going to exhaust them by the time you wrap up and you even decide to put in funds maybe 1.5 years from that time. Who has the patience? I mean, the situation is going terrible right now. We need to have financing within 6 months or so. Country platforms is one of those approaches which I don't think we will cut down the time so much per se, but at least a stronger, predictable model of having various different partners come into a specific country with a specified, well-understood, government-owned, country-led approach, where it's not the MDBs necessarily pushing them along in a particular direction, but it is the countries taking ownership of their own LTS, the long-term strategies and the trajectories with NDCs, to then tell the likes of development banks such as Eurasian and ISDB and ADB and everybody else, but this is what we expect from you guys, what can you do, and how can you all come together. So again, country platform is a budding, repeated instrument from the G20. They've been expecting the MDBs and development finance institutions to do that. Perhaps we've taken our time to come to the right model and mechanism, but we seem to be on the cusp of getting somewhere with some of the delivery items. And Smara, you know better than anyone on how country platforms are generated and where do they stand with the potential they should be having in the next 16 months.
No, what you're saying is that it has to be country-led, country-driven, client-oriented for country platforms. But since I'm the moderator, I will not put in any more thoughts on country platforms. But anyway, over to you, Sujata. You were earlier you were saying about enabling an environment, supply-driven. I think, and Sayed has alluded to, there could be a lot of climate finance, right? It's out there, but it's also sometimes the demand, the kind of projects that are available for investments, either for concessional or grants. Sometimes they're not out there. What do you think are the challenges? I mean, I think that part of the equation has to also be scaled up in some way. From in this point of view, what has been your experience?
Okay, I fully agree. There's a lot of innovative financial models which are available and accessible to even local institutions, not only for MDBs, even locally. If you see the banks in India are able to raise sustainability linked bonds. So recently there is this export-import bank which raised a 1 billion green bonds, sustainability linked bonds for lending, and they are already exhausted. They have been deployed in the market. But when we engage with such banks, what we notice is, one is there is no common, even for why only vulnerable countries. I think everywhere the main challenge we see is the taxonomy. Now, even if you raise a bond, even if you raise funds, but as a lender, I do not know which projects should fall into this category, though I have raised for the purpose, right? So either I go black or white, there is no in between. How do I grade? How do I assess those projects? Even if it is a sustainable project, to what extent can I fund it? So that capacity and capability is really missing on the ground. I would say that getting or access to fund for institutions are not a difficult task, but then how do they deploy it across and make projects accessible is very important. Taxonomy is a huge, huge challenge. How you define a sustainable investment or a climate investment is a huge challenge. Third, again, what we are doing currently in India with the World Bank, with the country offices, as you rightly mentioned, that for investable project, as you know, there are multiple states in India, each of them having their own climate challenge. So what we are doing right now is like how India is committed to net zero under NDC. Similarly, each of the states are committed to their own net zero pathway. Second, they all have their own economic aspirations. Like if I am going to reach net zero by say 2070, but I also have an economic aspiration to reach a 1 trillion GDP by say 2047. So I have an economic aspiration, I have a net zero aspiration, and I also have my local reality in terms of my climate vulnerability, in terms of my skill set available, in terms of my potential for renewable or any other source of renewable energy. Now with World Bank, what we are trying to do is, this is the framework we are developing, that how do I marry these three documents and create investable opportunities for the state, which aligns with all these three pillars. And then it is very easy to bring in private sector or even governments in terms of bringing in some incentives or policies to encourage those kind of investments. So that is what we are trying to do. And in terms of risk, again, as you rightly mentioned, they are under very huge risk in terms of climate vulnerability. So MDBs and other, they can come in terms of guaranteeing or risk premium through philanthropy money. I don't know. So those are some of the instruments we should explore, at least to cover that risk premium part when there is a loss of income.
No, thanks. Before I do another round of questions, and I think this discussion is quite short because we only had 45 minutes, I wanted to ask the audience if they have any burning questions for any of the panelists. Okay, yes, please. Who are you? Please introduce yourself and who do you want to answer your question as well.
Hello everyone, this is Meltem from Coca-Cola Company. I lead sustainability for Eurasia and Middle East region. And my question is to Mr. Conrad and Mr. Syed, actually everyone, because I will ask some project examples that you're proud of that you supported so far.
Well, thank you very much. General projects or anything in particular? Okay, so there are some projects which we are pretty proud of right now. Since we're in the region, I just wanted to mention that the projects which I'll give you the typology and then I'll give you the example if time allows. Essentially projects in which we are co-financing with the partners that we want to be able to co-finance with in a manner that is concessional for the country that we are financing them for. And that basically, and the project has both mitigation and an adaptation mechanism. So it is reducing GHG emissions and is able to ensure that there is adaptation. So I would select like these are the three criterias, and then whatever fits in that specific criteria, I would consider as those projects which I'm most proud of. So in the region, for instance, and I think Conrad, you would be also interested, is that we are financing a $3 billion project with various different co-financiers, of which ISDP is putting in $1.15 billion in Kazakhstan on a water supply irrigation project. In Azerbaijan, we are about to just sign tomorrow a critical project on Maidan water supply. So water supply projects has both strong mitigation adaptation components. These are high volume projects. And I'm not trying to discount the smaller socio-economic development projects, absolutely none whatsoever. But if you are an MDB and if you have those financial resources, try to put it in a manner which is as less burdensome as possible. So with that criteria, I would say that the recent water projects, irrigation projects that we are building and rebuilding some of the irrigation canals. So it's not always about coming up with new infrastructure, it's about fixing existing infrastructure. That could last for another 50 to 60 years. So, yeah.
Oh, thanks. But before, implementing
in
partner.
Kazakhstan, it's essentially government-owned PMUs and agencies, yes.
Okay, but before I go to Conrad, I just wanted to add on what Syed was saying, right? Water in this region is actually a critical sector, and many of the MDBs and private sector are actually investing it. But one thing that we always forget is that in the flow of climate finance, most in the mitigation side goes to transport and energy. But what we're forgetting is that agriculture and water has actually one of the higher potential in terms of how we reduce GHG emissions, actually. But then not enough money is flowing into that sector. So it's good. It's a great example right there. Yes, Conrad, over to you.
Yeah, and absolutely. And this is the most, I would say, one of the most climate sensitive and risky regions, especially Central Asia. And we have the three countries that I mentioned before, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, as our member countries, and Uzbekistan, hopefully very soon as well as part of the crew. I fully endorse what he said, because we really look for the enduring effects that our projects will have, especially in our case, as I said before, mitigation aspects, and we are very open to learn from the other peers. They're more capable, they have more scalability for adaptation, not because we don't want, because we have the legacy always very capable to do more on mitigation side, as our bank has a more niched focus on infrastructure. So we also look very careful on the modernization of the existing plants, the grid, the infrastructure that is from the energy sector. That's the bulk of what we have, but nevertheless, we're not just excluding the other sectors. We also need to look for how really bankable they can be on the project side. So when we look for the enterprises, we're going to be lending the money. So it's an additional, I would say, layer that we have to take care of when we have grants, when we have other financial mechanisms that can be also implemented. And technical assistance is very important in our end, that we can really make more bankable those projects that say in more water related, and the nexus from irrigation or any other industries that are also part of very important in the region. As an example, recent, let's say, bankable projects that we deliver in the region, they're more on renewable energy. Of course, we have Kulanak plant in Kazakhstan and other plants also in Kyrgyzstan. And we also look for Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. We see how it's important to expand even more the hydropower potential. There is already very, very much more green, let's say, the matrix of those countries. But nevertheless, how dependent and the energy security on those are. So with other models that can be expanded for solar, and also, of course, when we look for wind power generation. But in our case, I would say again, is how we can also partner more with other co-financiers to scoop out or to carve out more projects that can be bankable from the bank, in our case, and the EDB.
Okay, thank you. Sujata, do you want to add to it a bit?
In terms of MDBs, how we work in a country is mostly we use them for technical assistance and supporting those projects. And if it is large infrastructure projects, which is running into billions of dollars, that's where the MDBs step in terms of getting some concessional funding to the government. Otherwise, locally, how government scale up sustainable investments or climate investments is, one is like, say, for example, at least from India's perspective, we have performance-linked incentive in sectors which are relevant for clean transition. Could be a EV subsidy for performance-linked plans, or it could be a policy which says that you need to buy a EV beyond this particular year, so which will create a demand for the product. Similarly, we also have other interventions like a green hydrogen mission, or it could be many other government intervention which creates that funding availability to private sector. So the motive here is how do we mobilize more private funding into projects, and MDBs and other philanthropy money is just becoming that, initial acceleration or initial push so that it takes off on its own. So that's always the intent, and it's mostly the private sector and businesses which then steps in and scale it up.
Okay, thank you. And Aniket, quickly.
Very briefly.
Yes.
We don't have a plethora of projects, but we have, as an outcome of the Doha Programme of Action for the Least Developed Countries, the request to set up a resilience building mechanism, which is something that we're doing at the moment, and it will have three prongs to it. The first is on early warnings for multi-hazard early warning systems. The second is economic resilience building, and here we'll have try to scale up capacity for green bonds and similar initiatives. And then the third is to support LDCs rolling out NAPs and bankable projects. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, I know we don't have too much time. I think we have 2 minutes, but I don't want to let these 4 people go yet. I'm going to give you 20 seconds to say, I mean, it's a climate finance COP. It's a climate finance side event. At the personal level, what are you hoping for to see as an outcome from the new collective quantified goal? Because there's a lot of elements, right? Just the quantum, the access, the quality, you know, the barriers that needs to be broken down, etc. So from your, it doesn't have to be at that institutional level, but from a personal level, 10, 15 seconds, any dream or expectation or hope that will come out by end of next week. And maybe, Aniket, we can start off with you, please.
Thank you. I would say access.
Access.
That's my main takeaway, because that's something which the most vulnerable countries are grappling with, and yesterday's LDC experts group meeting confirmed that.
Thank you. Access, LDCs.
I would say more collaboration and understanding of the local elements. Rather than top-down, it should be more collaborative.
Yeah, there's a lot of elements that you have been saying, even initially, about locally led, because you had at the national level expectations and goal, but it's also too localized to be able to deliver the climate actions that are needed. Yes, Conrad, please.
Yes, I will echo that both comments. So from the global north to the global south, so we're representing my region and personally where I'm based in Central Asia. I think that's collaboration and access is uttermost important going forward, especially to the, let's say, South community.
Thank you. And Syed?
Although I started my remarks by criticizing pledging and empty promises, but we do need more pledge. There's no hiding from that.
The quantum,
You have to, quantum.
critical.
It starts with quantum, and then you keep quantum and keep their feet on the fire.
No, and with that, my 10 seconds would be, you know, it's not access, predictable, scalable, but I think at the end of the day, climate finance has to be impactful as well as transformative. And please join me in thanking this group of panel members for their time today, and I wish we had more time to discuss such an important topic. Thank you.